In light of the length of the report, the statement that I make will be fairly long. But after the statement is ended, then I'm happy to stay and take questions for as long as you want to ask them. The decision to go to war in Iraq and to remove Saddam Hussein from power in a coalition of over 40 countries led by the United States of America was the hardest, most momentous, most agonizing decision I took in my 10 years as British Prime Minister. For that decision today, I accept full responsibility, without exception and without excuse. I recognize the division felt by many in our country over the war, and in particular, I feel deeply and sincerely, in a way that no words can properly convey, the grief and suffering of those who lost ones they loved in Iraq, whether members of our armed forces, the armed forces of other nations, or Iraqis. The intelligence assessments made at the time of going to war turned out to be wrong. The aftermath turned out to be more hostile, protracted, and bloody than ever we imagined. The coalition planned for one set of ground facts and encountered another. And a nation whose people we wanted to set free and secure from the evil of Saddam became instead victim to sectarian terrorism. For all of this, I express more sorrow, regret, and apology than you may ever know or can believe. Only two things I cannot say. It's claimed by some that by removing Saddam, we caused the terrorism today in the Middle East, and that it would have been better to have left him in power. I profoundly disagree. Saddam was himself a wellspring of terror, a continuing threat to peace and to his own people. If he'd been left in power in 2003, then I believe he would once again have threatened world peace, and when the Arab revolutions of 2011 began, he would have clung to power with the same deadly consequences that we see in the carnage in Syria today. Whereas at least in Iraq, for all its challenges, we have today a government that is elected, is recognized as internationally legitimate, and is fighting terrorism with the support of the international community. The world was and is, in my judgment, a better place without Saddam Hussein. Secondly, I will never agree that those who died or were injured made their sacrifice in vain. They fought in the defining global security struggle of the 21st century against the terrorism and violence, which the world over destroys lives, divides communities, and their sacrifice should always be remembered with thanksgiving and with honor when that struggle is eventually won, as it will be. I know some of the families cannot and do not accept this is so. I know there are those who can never forget or forgive me for having taken this decision, and who think that I took it dishonestly. As the report makes clear, there were no lies. Parliament and Cabinet were not misled. There was no secret commitment to war. Intelligence was not falsified, and the decision was made in good faith. However, I accept that the report makes serious criticisms of the way decisions were taken. And again, I accept full responsibility for these points of criticism, even where I do not fully agree with them. I do not think it is fair or accurate to criticize the armed forces, the intelligence services, or the civil service. It was my decision they were acting upon. The armed forces in particular did an extraordinary job throughout our engagement in Iraq in the incredibly difficult mission we gave them. I pay tribute to them. Any faults derive from my decisions and should not attach to them. They are people of enormous dedication and courage, and the country should be very proud of them. Today is therefore the right moment to go back, however, and look at the history of that time, so that those, even if they passionately disagree, will at least understand why I did what I did, and learn lessons so that we do better in the future. First, why was Saddam a threat? My premiership changed completely on the 11th of September 2001. 9/11 was the worst terrorist atrocity in history. Over 3,000 people died that day in America, including many British people, making it the worst ever loss of life of our own country's citizens from any single terror attack. In fact, 9/11 was not, of course, the first attack. Prior to then, 23 countries had suffered terrorist attacks of this nature. In 2002, 20 different nations lost people to terrorism. For over 20 years as well, the regime of Saddam had become a notorious source of conflict and bloodshed in the Middle East. He had attempted a nuclear weapons program, only halted by a preventive strike by the Israeli military in 1981. He'd used chemical weapons in the war he began with Iran, a war which lasted 7 years with around 1 million casualties. Out of the Iranian experience came Iran's own nuclear weapons program. He invaded Kuwait in 1990. He used chemical weapons extensively against his own people. For example, in the massacre of Halabja, where thousands died in a single day. The international community made frequent attempts to bring him into compliance with UN resolutions, calling for him to give up his programs. As at March 2003, he was in breach of no fewer than 17 such UN resolutions. In 1998, following the ejection of UN weapons inspectors from Iraq, President Clinton and I authorized military strikes on his facilities, and from that point, regime change in Iraq became the official policy of the US administration. In a country where a majority of Iraqis are Shia Muslims and 20% of the population Kurds, he ruled with an unparalleled brutality, with a government drawn almost exclusively from the Sunni 20% minority, though many of his victims were also Sunni. Saddam was not the only developer of weapons of mass destruction. Libya had a program. North Korea was trying to obtain nuclear technology. The network of the Pakistani scientist A.Q. Khan was an active proliferator of such technology, and Iran's program had begun. But only one regime had actually used such weapons, that of Saddam. Intelligence, still valid, indicated al-Qaeda wanting to acquire such material, and 9/11 showed that they were prepared to cause mass casualties. So it's important, now that we're here 15 years after 9/11, to recall the atmosphere at that time. America had never suffered such an attack on its own soil before. Its population were devastated. They regarded themselves at war. The Taliban, who had given sanctuary to al-Qaeda, had been removed from power in Afghanistan in November 2001. But the 2002 Bali bombings, in which over 200 victims, mainly Australians, lost their lives, showed the continuing threat. All Western nations were changing their security posture. We were in a new world. And at that time, we did not know where the next attack, threat, or danger would come from. The fear of the US administration, which I shared, was of the possibility of terrorist groups acquiring, either by accident or by design, chemical weapons, biological weapons, or even a primitive nuclear device. The report accepts that after 9/11, the calculus of risk changed fundamentally. We believed we had to change policy on nations developing such weapons in order to eliminate the possibility of WMD and terrorism coming together. Saddam's regime was the place to start, not because he represented the only threat, but because his was the only regime actually to have used such weapons. There were outstanding UN resolutions in respect of him, and his record of bloodshed suggested he was capable of aggressive, unpredictable, catastrophic actions. In addition, the UN sanctions imposed on Iraq were crumbling, and therefore containment was faltering. The final Iraq survey report, which was conducted into Saddam's WMD program and ambitions after the Iraq War, and whose findings are accepted in this report, found that Saddam did indeed intend to go back to developing the programs after the removal of sanctions. So I ask people to put themselves in my shoes as Prime Minister. Back then, barely more than a year from 9/11, in late 2002 and early 2003, you're seeing the intelligence mount up on WMD. You're doing so in a changed context of mass casualties caused by a new and virulent form of terrorism. You have at least to consider the possibility of a 9/11 here in Britain. And your primary responsibility as Prime Minister is to protect your country. These were my considerations at the time. The lead up to war, there was no rush to war. The inquiry rightly dismisses the conspiracy theory that I pledged Britain unequivocally to military action at Crawford, Texas in April 2002. I did not and could not, as they explicitly in their report conclude. I was absolutely clear, publicly and privately, however, that we would be with the USA in dealing with this issue. And I made that clear in the note to President Bush of the 28th of July 2002. But I also said we had to proceed in the right way. And I set out the conditions necessary, especially that we should then go down the UN route and avoid precipitate action, as indeed the inquiry report finds. So, as again the inquiry finds, I persuaded a reluctant American administration to take the issue back to the UN. This resulted in the November 2002 UN Resolution 1441, giving Saddam, I quote, a final opportunity to come into, I quote, full and immediate compliance with UN resolutions and to cooperate fully with UN inspectors. Any non-compliance was defined as a material breach. Finally, and only under threat of military action, Saddam permitted inspectors to return. But his cooperation was neither full nor immediate. See the report of the inspectors to the UN in January 2003 and that of the 7th of March 2003, again referred to in the body of the report. However, by then, there was substantial disagreement in the UN Security Council. America wanted action. President Putin and the leadership of France did not. In a final attempt to bridge the division, I agreed with the inspectors a set of 6 tests based on Saddam's non-compliance, with which he had to comply immediately, which included things like interviews with those responsible for his program, and which up to then had been refused, except in country where obviously these people would be subject to intimidation. So these 6 tests were drawn up in a resolution accompanied by an ultimatum. The non-compliance would result in military action. So again, I had secured American agreement to a new resolution, setting tests, which, if he had passed, would have avoided military action. But the United States understandably insisted that in the event of continued failure, the UN had to be clear that action would follow. And this was the approach rejected by Saddam. The Americans in the UK and other partners from over 40 nations had assembled a force in the Gulf ready for military action. President Bush made it clear he was going to act. The British government, under my leadership, chose to be part of that action, a decision endorsed by Parliament, with the leaders of the opposition being given access to exactly the same intelligence and advice presented to me. Now, the inquiry finds that as at the 18th of March, war was not, and I quote, the last resort. But given the impasse at the UN and the insistence of the United States for reasons I completely understood, and with hundreds of thousands of troops in theatre which could not be kept there indefinitely, it was the last moment of decision for us, as the report indeed accepts. By then, the US was going to war and to move with us or without us. Now, the inquiry finds that going to war without a majority of the UN Security Council in agreement undermined the authority of the UN. The reality is that we, Britain, had continually tried to act with the authority of the UN. I successfully convinced the Americans to go back to the UN in November 2002, as I said, and after the initial conflict, it was again Britain which put UN authority back in place for the aftermath, so that from June 2003, British troops were in Iraq with full UN authority. However, as at the 18th of March, there was gridlock at the UN. In Resolution 1441, it had been agreed to give Saddam one final opportunity to comply. It was accepted he had not done so. In that case, according to 1441, action should have followed. It didn't, because by then, politically, there was an impasse. I say the undermining of the UN was in fact the refusal to follow through on 1441. And with the subsequent statement from President Putin and the President of France that they would veto any new resolution authorizing action in the event of non-compliance, it was clearly not possible to get a majority of the UN to agree a new resolution. As the then President of Chile explained, there was no point since any decision by a majority would be vetoed. So, on the 18th of March, and this is the vital thing to understand, given especially what Sir John said this morning, we had come to the point of binary decision. Right to remove Saddam or not, with America or not. The report itself says this was a stark choice, and it was. Now, the inquiry claims that military action was not a last resort, though it also says it might have been necessary later. With respect, I didn't have the option of that delay. I had to decide. I thought of Saddam, his record, the character of his regime. I thought of our alliance with America, and it's important to us in the post-9/11 world, and I weighed it carefully. I took this decision with the heaviest of hearts. I had already, as the inquiry finds, consulted our armed forces and received their commitment to be part of it and their view that we should be part of it. If you read my private notes to President Bush from March 2002 onwards, you will see my caution, my recognition this was not like Kosovo or Afghanistan, and my desire to do this, if at all, peacefully. But as of the 17th of March 2003, there was no middle way. No further time for deliberation, no room for more negotiation. A decision had to be taken, and it was mine to take as Prime Minister. I took it. I accept full responsibility for it. I stand by it. I only ask with humility that the British people accept that I took this decision because I believe that it was the right thing to do based on the information that I had and the threats I perceived. And that my duty as Prime Minister at that moment in time in 2003 was to do what I thought was right, however imperfect the situation or indeed the process. At moments of crisis such as this, it's the profound obligation of the person leading the government of our country to take responsibility and to decide. Not to hide behind politics, expediency, or even emotion, but to recognize that it is a privilege above all others to lead this nation. But the accompaniment of that privilege, when the interests of our nation are so supremely and plainly at stake, is to lead and not to shy away, to decide and not to avoid decision, to discharge that responsibility and not to duck it. Neither history nor the fierce and raucous conduct of modern politics, with all its love of conspiracy theories and its willingness and addiction to believing the worst of everyone, should falsify my motive in this. I knew it was not a popular decision. I knew what its cost might be politically, though that shrinks into complete insignificance beside the human cost. I did it because I thought it was right, and because I thought the human cost of inaction, of leaving Saddam in power, would be greater for us and for the world in the longer term. So the action commenced on the 18th of March. In less than 2 months, American and British armed forces and those of other nations successfully deposed Saddam. And that part of the campaign, which was, after all, a major part of our strategic objectives, was brilliantly conducted by our military, and we should never forget that. In June 2003, a UN resolution was agreed putting the coalition forces in charge of helping the country to a new constitution with UN support and under a UN mandate. In August 2003, the UN mission had to withdraw, however, following the bombing of the UN headquarters in Baghdad by al-Qaeda. And in 2004, the country slid into chaos and instability, especially following the al-Qaeda bombing of the Samarra Shia mosque. A state of near civil war continued until the surge of American forces began in 2007, which restored the country to relative calm. In 2010, a largely peaceful election in which the party with the most votes was a non-sectarian coalition was held. And in 2010, al-Qaeda in Iraq was effectively defeated. In 2011, the Arab Spring began. The remnant of AQ Iraq left for Syria, built its base in Raqqa, and then came back over the border into Iraq, renamed as ISIS, and helped by the sectarian nature of the Maliki government, exploited the situation in Iraq and created what we see today. We should never forget that as a result of the removal of Saddam in 2003, Libya agreed to yield up its nuclear and chemical weapons program. This led to the complete destruction of a program under international inspection, which turned out to be much more advanced than we knew, which, had it remained in the hands of Gaddafi, would have itself posed a serious threat. The AQ car network was shut down. I come to our alliance with America. Whilst the inquiry accepted that it was my prerogative as Prime Minister to decide to be with the United States in military action, the inquiry questions whether this was really necessary and the importance I attach to the alliance. 9/11 was an event like no other in US history. I considered it an attack on all the free world. I believed that Britain, as America's strongest ally, should be with them in tackling this new and unprecedented security challenge. I believed it important that America was not alone, but part of a wider coalition. In the end, even a majority of European Union nations supported action in Iraq. I do not believe that we would have had that coalition, or indeed persuaded the Bush administration to go down the UN path, without our commitment to be alongside them in this fight. Throughout my time as Prime Minister, first with the Clinton administration and then with the Bush one, Britain was recognized as the United States' foremost ally. It served us well in Kosovo and allowed us to protect more innocent people than we could have alone. We were America's core partner in the post-9/11 world, and I believe that was right. I believe there are two essential pillars to British foreign policy: our alliance with the United States and our partnership in Europe, and we should keep both strong as a vital national interest. Now, people can disagree with that, but that was my judgment as Prime Minister. I come to Saddam and weapons of mass destruction. For more than half a decade, I've always apologized for the inaccurate intelligence, in particular for the intelligence that Saddam had a stockpile of chemical weapons. The inquiry endorses the findings of both the Hutton inquiry and the Butler inquiry that there is no evidence that intelligence was improperly included in the September 2002 dossier, or that Number 10 improperly influenced the text. But though it makes no finding of impropriety, it finds that the intelligence had not established beyond doubt that Saddam possessed WMD. I only ask that people read the reports given to me, first in March 2002 and then in September 2002, and on many other occasions, for example, in the note written by my senior advisor days before military action. In hindsight, we may know that some of this information was not correct, but I had to act on the information I had at the time. I would point out two other things. First, that virtually every intelligence agency had reached the same conclusion, and for very good reasons. Saddam's previous use of weapons, his complete disregard for the mass destruction of human life, and the eviction of UN inspectors in 1998. Secondly, it is essential to consider the findings of the Iraq Survey Group, conducted by a leading UN weapons inspector with 1,400 people in his team. This was done after the war, in 2004, on the basis of interviews, including with Saddam himself and his leading officials. The very interviews denied the inspectors in 2003. It's right to read that report because it is authoritative. The inquiry itself calls it significant. But with respect to them, they never explain its significance. The survey group finds that Saddam's priority in the late 1990s and in 2001 to 2003 was to get sanctions lifted. But once they were lifted, they find it was his intent to reconstitute his program, since he believed it to be essential to his personal and political survival. Above all, this survey group report finds that he intended to go back to a nuclear program, fearing the Iranian development of nuclear weapons, and that he kept his teams and capability to develop those and chemical weapons once sanctions were removed. Now, of course, we can never know whether he would have done this. But I ask, if you knew that for a fact this dictator had used chemical weapons on his own people and those of other nations, for a fact he had lied about having them so he could continue to produce and use them, and for a fact that he had killed thousands of his own people and those in other countries with no respect whatever for human life or norms of civilized behavior, would you have wanted to take that risk of leaving him in place, or would you wanted to eliminate it? Saddam, in my view, was going to pose a threat for as long as he was in power. Now, the planning and the aftermath. The inquiry makes several criticisms of the planning process for the aftermath of the invasion. I accept that, especially in hindsight, we should have approached the situation differently. These criticisms are significant. They include failures to seek assurances of better planning from the American side, which I accept, should have been sought. The failures in American planning are well documented and accepted. I do note, nonetheless, that the inquiry fairly and honestly admit that they have not, even after this passage of time, been able to identify alternative approaches which would have guaranteed greater success. And this, I would suggest, is for the very simple reason that the terrorism we faced and did not expect would have been difficult in any circumstances to counter. This is the lesson we learn from other conflict zones, especially Libya, Syria, Yemen, but others also. Our planning proceeded on the basis of those risks of which we were principally warned, namely the possibility of a humanitarian disaster, the use of WMD by Saddam, resistance from the regime, and the challenges of reconstruction. In the event, though the report does not deal with this in detail, the real problems were those caused by terrorism and from quarters we did not expect. Al-Qaeda, whose attacks on the UN, on reconstruction, and on the Shia population, tipped the country to the brink of civil war in 2004 to 2006. IED attacks and other acts of terrorism from the Shia militia, supported by Iran. The inquiry does find that there were warnings about sectarian fighting and bloodletting. I accept that. But I would point out that nowhere were these highlighted as the main risk, and in any event, what we faced was not the anticipated internal bloodletting, but an all-out insurgency stimulated by external arms and money. We also now know that the Assad regime in Syria was deliberately sending terrorists across the border to cause terror and instability. And this had a major impact on the coalition's ability to make progress in the country. In short, we ended up fighting exactly the same elements that we're fighting everywhere in the world today from the same origins: Shia extremism on the one hand and Sunni extremism on the other. The consequence was that as we were trying to rehabilitate the country, those elements were trying to wreck our efforts by sectarian violence, and that is what we did not foresee. The inquiry finds that in particular in January 2003, there were no full options papers presented to Cabinet. I note that Cabinet alone debated Iraq 26 times in the run-up to conflict. There were 28 meetings of the ad hoc committee with relevant ministers present. However, I accept I could have and should have insisted on the presentation of a formal options paper to Cabinet. I come to the legality. The report does not make a finding on the legal judgment of the then Attorney General. There are very good reasons for not disputing it. The whole negotiating history of Resolution 1441 in the UN made it clear that the US and the UK had always refused language that obliged the second resolution. The defining of the obligations of Iraq and the agreement that failure fully and immediately to comply was a material breach was a reasonable basis for action. The advice of the Attorney General was in line with that of other law officers in other nations and distinguished legal experts, though I fully acknowledge and respect that others took a different view. Where the politics is hotly contested, the law will be also. I understand why the inquiry finds that the process of coming to the legal opinion was far from satisfactory, but it does not alter the legal conclusion. It was after the detailed meetings the Attorney General had with US and UK officials explaining the negotiating history of 1441 that he came to the view that it was not necessary for a second resolution. On the 27th of February, he gave that view orally. On the 7th of March, he provided that advice in writing. I accept in retrospect it would have been better to have provided the full written advice to Cabinet, that this was not the legal precedent and in any event was not requested by the Cabinet. I accept there is a case for providing it to Parliament. But none of these matters of process alter the fact that his advice in the end was clear and is not challenged by the inquiry. Inquiry at one point says there was no indication of why I gave my view to the Attorney General that Saddam, as at the 13th of March 2003, was in material breach of 1441. As the Attorney General has explained, my view was not legally necessary since 1441 had determined what constituted a breach. But nonetheless, he sought my confirmation of what I thought. Saddam was accepted by everyone, including the inspectors, not to be fully complying. He had a long history of deception. The whole basis of my 6 tests was to address the failure to comply. Indeed, intelligence that is still considered valid shows Saddam at the time in breach of UN resolutions instructing his officials to remove any evidence of WMD or programs for its development. The issue was rather whether, despite the breach, he should be given more time. I accept, of course, it is better politically if the Security Council makes such a determination. But by then, given the position in the Security Council with a fundamental disagreement, it was clear there would be no agreement, irrespective of the circumstances. I come to this important point: is the world safer or less safe as a result of the removal of Saddam in 2003? The report never deals with this issue in specific terms. But again, with respect to inquiry, this issue has to be debated if we are to reach a conclusion on the wisdom of the judgment I made. I ask that fair-minded people at least consider the following. If we had withdrawn the threat of action in 2003 and pulled back our forces, we would have found it almost impossible to reassemble those forces in that number. Now, Sir John says today that it might have been necessary to take military action later. He accepts that. But I don't see how we would have reassembled that force. Sanctions would have swiftly eroded. Over time, I would suggest, it would have been hard to have kept an invasive process of inspection in place. So Saddam would have remained and immensely politically strengthened. Plus, he would have had the benefit of $100 a barrel oil. This is where the Iraq Survey Group is so important. It indicates that he would have resumed his earlier development of nuclear and chemical weapons. If that is conceivable, as it surely is, then his removal avoided what would otherwise have been an unacceptable risk, in my judgment. I acknowledge completely and I respect the other point of view. I simply ask that people respect my point of view and the judgment I took on the facts I had at the time. We then come to the state of Iraq today, because it's still engaged in conflict, a conflict that goes on all over the Middle East. But to those who say, but for the action in 2003, Iraq will be peaceful in 2016, I ask them to consider the following. There is no doubt that the sectarian policies of the Maliki government contributed to the renewed conflict in Iraq. But the decisive event of the last 5 years in the Middle East is the Arab Spring, which began in 2011. Starting in Tunisia, regimes across North Africa and the Middle East were toppled or put under sustained attack. In the case of Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and Yemen, the regimes fell. Then in early 2011, the revolt of the Syrian people against the Assad regime began. In Syria, as with the Saddam regime in Iraq, effectively a small minority ruled the majority on sectarian lines, except in this case, in the case of Syria with the Sunni in the majority. Between 2003 and 2011, by the way, all of those regimes had remained in power. Not one of them had changed. So supposing Saddam had stayed in power in 2003, I ask this counterfactual. Is it likely that he would still have been in power in 2011, when the Arab Spring began? Is it likely that the Iraqi people would have joined the Arab Spring when all the countries were part of it, and this was the most tyrannical regime of any of them, with the vast majority of people excluded from power? And is it likely that if the Iraqi people had revolted, if there had been an uprising, that he would have reacted like Assad in Syria? Surely it's at least possible that the answer to all of those questions is affirmative. In that case, the nightmare of Syria today would also be happening in Iraq, except with the Shia-Sunni balance inverted. Consider the consequences of that. Even if you disagreed with removing Saddam in 2003, we should be thankful we're not dealing with him and his two sons now. Saddam was himself deeply sectarian. As the latest research shows, the leadership of the regime was heavily sectarian and deliberately made so. And to those who think removing Saddam is the cause of the turmoil in the Middle East, and that there is some unbroken line between the removal of Saddam in 2003 and what is happening in Iraq today, I say the following. After the surge of 2007, al-Qaeda was defeated and marginalized. In 2010, Iraq was relatively stable. It was in Syria. After the Arab Spring, when AQ became ISIS, headquartered in Raqqa, Syria, where we failed to intervene, Syria, the very opposite of the policy of intervention, where more people have died than in the whole of Iraq, with the worst refugee crisis since World War II, and with no agreement as to the future. At least for all the challenges in Iraq today, there is a government actually fighting the terrorism and doing so with Western support, internationally recognized, including by Saudi Arabia and Iran, as the legitimate government, and with a prime minister welcome in the White House and in capitals across the globe. None of this excuses the mistakes we made. None of this excuses the failures. for which, I repeat, I take full responsibility and apologize. But it shows that in the uncertain and dangerous world we live in, all decisions are difficult. Each has consequences predicted and unpredicted. And the only thing a decision maker can do is to take those decisions on the basis of what they genuinely believe to be right, and that is what I did. On the final passage, I will draw a few lessons from this conflict and then conclude, and then take your questions for as long as you wish to ask them. So I was the Prime Minister in the period after 9/11 and through Iraq and Afghanistan. Since then, I've spent the bulk of my time in the Middle East and studied the origins and character of Islamist extremism. What is clear is that this extremism is a global problem not confined to the well-known theatres of the Middle East or Pakistan or Afghanistan. It's across Africa, including Nigeria, Chad, Niger, Mali, Somalia, Asia, including the Philippines, Thailand, and Bangladesh. It's in Central Asia. And of course, we have terrorist attacks here in Europe and in the United States. I've watched today's decision makers wrestle in Libya and Syria with the same types of dilemma I did. At a later time, I'll publish more detailed proposals about lessons from Iraq and other areas of conflict, but I'll summarize them briefly here. The first is that the danger of revolution or regime change in any country where Islamism is likely to be a major factor is that once the dictatorship is removed, no matter how abhorrent, elements of extremism will move into the vacuum to cause chaos and instability. So unlike Kosovo, or indeed even Germany after World War II, the challenge becomes not one of reconstruction, but of security. Therefore, if possible, evolution or an agreed process of change is better than the overthrow of the existing order without agreement. That is why when the Arab Spring began, it would have been better to have tried to agree processes of transition in Libya and Syria so as to control the aftermath and make change without destroying stability. It would be sensible now as a precaution to invest in nation building in those parts of the world where we're plainly over time at risk of failed states collapsing and leading to further centers of extremism. Certain states in Africa are a clear example. Some parts of development aid should be devoted to this. Second, where we've decided to intervene in a majority Muslim country, then we need to do so in a strong alliance with Muslim nations. Otherwise, we risk being accused, however unfairly, of intervening in those countries because they are Muslim and not because they represent a security or humanitarian threat. Third, the war waged by terrorist groups requires a completely different type of military strategy and capability from conventional warfare between nations. We now have huge experience of this from around the world. We need to construct the new doctrines and capabilities which allow us to do so effectively and with the right alliances within the West, within the Muslim world, and between us. For us in the West, the pain of taking casualties in a fight that is often politically controversial and which does not involve defense of our own territory is now so great that we risk a situation where political leaders are reluctant to commit, especially ground forces, to combat. On the other hand, Western forces, particularly those of the United States and UK, have the most experience and the highest level of capability. This needs an active consideration of whether we require a different level of volunteering for these missions. Otherwise, we're fighting without the best available forces to do the work. And for the UK, we have to have an active debate, including with our armed forces, about our desired levels of participation in such missions. Given that we will always be a partner, and in the case of the USA, a junior partner in terms of assets and capacity. Fourth, we can all agree in principle the UN is the right body to decide issues of international policy, including the justification for the use of force. But the reality is the UN is gridlocked effectively with Russia and USA regularly on different sides on similar issues. How can the UN be reformed? How can a clearer set of rules be agreed with a greater measure of objectivity? Fifth, we must understand the true nature of the threat we face. It is Islamist extremism and its ideology, and we need urgently to put in place a unified, comprehensive strategy to defeat it. This should be a combination of hard and soft power, including a global commitment on education to reform education systems, the encouragement of modern-minded and reformist clerics within Islam, and an effective countering of the propaganda of the extremists. And then we need an honest debate in the West about our own values and level of commitment to them. The West has a big decision to take. Does it believe it has a strategic interest in the outcome of the struggle in the Middle East and elsewhere around these issues of Islamist extremism? And if so, what level of commitment is it prepared to make to shape the outcome? My view is obviously that it does have such an interest and should make the necessary commitment. So in conclusion, many will find it impossible to reconcile themselves to the decision to remove Saddam or my motives in taking it. But it is vital we do not continue to allow controversy over Iraq to obscure what are real contemporary threats to world security, which reflect absolutely the difficulties we actually encountered in Iraq. This extremism menaces so many nations, those who were with us in Iraq and those who opposed Iraq, those who have an aggressive foreign policy and those who have a Pacific one, developed and developing nations, north and south, wealthy and poor. This is the scourge of our time. It's the challenge of our generation. It requires us to act bravely, even when imperfectly. At some point, we will reach for and achieve the unified, comprehensive foreign and defense policy that can defeat it. Iraq will be a chapter in this struggle and an important one. But it wasn't the first, and it won't be the last. I want to thank Sir John and his team for the report, for the time and care it's taken. I also want this day to pay tribute to Sir Martin Gilbert, who so tragically passed away before the report was concluded. We can't make decisions with the benefit of hindsight, but we can and we should learn from our experience and from the mistakes that were made. I hope future leaders can learn from those that I made, so that our determination in confronting terrorism and violence is not less, but our ability to do so effectively is much greater. The decisions I made, I have carried with me for 13 years, and will do so for the rest of my days. There will not be a day of my life where I do not relive and rethink what happened. People sometimes ask me why I spend so much time in the Middle East today. This is why. It's why I work on Middle East peace, on the dialogue between faiths, on how we can prevent young people growing up with hatred in their hearts towards those who look, think, or believe differently from them. It's my belief that if we learn the right lessons today, if we do, the next generation will see the dawn of a lasting peace in the place where all this began and where it must finally end, which is the Middle East. Thank you. Now, questions.
Mr. Blair, you say you take responsibility and you apologise. Two quick questions. One is, you have said in the past you would do it again. Would you still stand by that? And secondly, would you reply now through the cameras to the families of the soldiers who died, who said the question they'd like to ask you is, look me in the eye and tell me you did not mislead the nation?
I can look not just the families of this country, but the nation in the eye and say, I did not mislead this country. I made the decision in good faith on the information I had at the time. And I believe that it is better that we took that decision. I acknowledge all the problems that came with that decision. I acknowledge the mistakes and accept responsibility for them. What I cannot do and will not do is say I believe we took the wrong decision. I believe I made the right decision and that the world is better and safer as a result of it. Now, many people can disagree with it, that's their prerogative. But as this report makes clear, and it does, when you go through the report, there were no lies, there was no deceit, there was no deception, but there was a decision. And it was a controversial decision to remove Saddam and a decision to be with America. Now, many people would disagree with both of those decisions. Sir John Chilcot came quite close to it this morning. That's fine, but if you're going to do that, you have to say what the consequences of the opposite decision would have been. Because the point about being Prime Minister is you're the decision maker. You sit in the seat and take the decision. And your obligation to the country is to take it as you believe it to be. And all of this stuff about lies and deceit, it's all a way of getting us to obscure what is the essence of the question. At that time, in March 2003, was that the right decision? And now, as we look back on it, 13 years later, would it have been better if we'd taken the opposite decision? And what would have been the consequences of that opposite decision? If you can't answer that question, then you're a commentator and not a decision maker. So I had to take the decision. And sometimes when people talk about this and talk about me in this regard, as if I don't, almost as if I don't care about the loss of life or the grief and suffering of the families, not just the families of our armed forces, but the families of all those who have died in Iraq since 2003. But I had to decide, are more people going to suffer? Are more people going to die if we leave this brutal dictator in place who'd already killed so many people? So that's the decision, I'm afraid.
Tony Blair, you wrote to George Bush in July 2002, 9 months before the war, "I am with you, whatever." Now, that does sound, and it was read by the Americans, like a blank check for war.
Well, first of all, it
and
wasn't.
Did you do enough to disabuse them of their reading of that as a blank check for war?
First of all, by the way, as the correspondence, not least between Colin Powell and Jack Straw makes clear, they didn't read it in that way. Neither could they have, because in July 2002, the whole purpose of my intervention with the president was to get him to go down the UN route. So after July 2002 comes November's UN resolution. Has Saddam complied with the UN resolution? That would have been the end of the matter. He didn't. But it was absolutely clear, and by the way, I think it's clear, I think even the words that continue after that statement in the memorandum, I think there was then a but, and I then explain all the difficulties and why this isn't like Kosovo and Afghanistan, why we have to proceed with enormous care. And the whole purpose of what I was doing was making it clear I was going to be with the Americans in dealing with this. That was absolutely clear. I said this in evidence to the inquiry, but we needed to go down the UN route.
But the but was never, "I will withdraw my support if you don't go along with these conditions."
No, the but was, but we have to go down the UN route. So if we don't go down the UN route, I'm not in a position where I can support this.
Can I talk about the binary decision you said that you had to make on the 18th of March 2003, bragging on ITV News? You took that decision, but the consequences of taking that decision were that if you had pulled back, the Americans would have gone through anyway. Our military contribution was irrelevant in getting the job done anyway. And by going through with it, when you faced a choice between your frustrations with pursuing diplomacy at a blocked UN and effectively pulling the trigger that you had already loaded because you couldn't keep the troops there indefinitely, was to plunge us, this country, for 14, 15 years of this agony. You could have said, no, I'm going to continue with the UN, and Saddam would have been gone anyway.
Well, hang on a minute. Let's just, because that's a really, really important point and needs to be dealt with. So let's just disaggregate that for a moment. So first of all, by the way, our forces did play an important part in removing Saddam. We were absolutely central.
Would have been overthrown anyway with the
Right.
US,
Okay.
right of US power
Okay.
there.
So what you're saying is that we should have pulled back at that point. We should have let the US do it. I don't know whether you think we should have been in the aftermath or out of the aftermath as well. That would have been a huge decision for this country to take. At that point, we were the US's strongest ally. I had actually gone and sought the commitment from our armed forces that they wanted to be part of this, that we should be part of it. And then right at the last minute, we were going to pull out and let the other countries go forward. And diplomacy had been exhausted, actually, in this sense. There was by then an impasse at the UN. Look, this is familiar to us today. You had Russia on the one side, the US on the other.
You give up. You just say, we have to choose war because we can't continue with a blockade.
Well, you then have to take a decision. And that's why I say, the problem with this debate on Iraq is once you clear out of the way all the allegations of deceit and so on, and, I hope people do actually read this report because it makes it clear those allegations can't be sustained. But in the end, I agree with you. But you've got to go back in my shoes as decision maker and say, at that moment, are we going to pull out, leave the US to do it, hoping that they do it, presumably?
Well, you said that they were going to go
Well,
ahead and do it?
yes, okay, they would have done it, but then we're saying we think it's the right thing to do, but we're not going to be part of it. I think that's very difficult.
One other question, on the
Sure.
same point, which is a fundamental point that you raised, which is this rejection, as you said, of the fact that the invasion was in no way in the aftermath not responsible with the terrorism that has gripped Iraq and the region. As you know very well, I mean, Al-Qaeda seeks what it calls ungoverned spaces in which to spread its hatred and violence. The way that the aftermath was unplanned for, or adequately planned for in the aftermath of the invasion, which is what the report lays out, ungoverned space was created in Iraq. The military was disbanded, the security forces, the intelligence services, all of it was eviscerated within months. And into that void came Al-Qaeda. What is happening in Syria today are being led by the very men who were in the American camps. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was in Camp Bakr and held there. He grew out of Al-Qaeda. So to say that what is happening in Syria today has no links with Iraq is disingenuous, is it
Well, I'm
not?
not saying it's got no links, but let's be very clear about this. Okay, you're completely right. Between 2000, particularly when the Civil War began, in 2004 to 2006, then I agree, Al-Qaeda used the removal of Saddam in order to move in and to create sectarian tension. But then came the surge, and the surge largely succeeded. So what shifted after 2010, remember, Iraq had an election in 2010, they elected their government then. Actually, the leading party in that election was one that was essentially secular. After that time, what changed dramatically was Syria. Now, you're right that there are people from Iraq who then went into Syria, but it was in the chaos of Syria, exactly the same point, by the way, in the chaos of Syria, in that ungovernable space, that's where ISIS came into being. They headquartered themselves at Raqqa, and they then went back over the border into Iraq. Now, my point, because you know we've had a debate about Syria these last years, my point is, I agree, when you leave that space ungovernable, that is where terrorism breeds. But non-intervention can also lead to those spaces being created. Partial intervention can lead to those spaces being created. And the one thing I've got to say about this report, and I say this with respect, but it's the difference between people writing a report and taking decisions. Nowhere in this report do they say what they believe would have happened if we had taken the decision they don't quite advocate it, but they imply. Nowhere did they say that. Now, if people are going to say the decision was wrong, they have at least to consider the points that I'm making, that Saddam might have gone back and reconstituted his program, as the Iraq Survey Group finds, and we might have had the same situation in Iraq today as we have in Syria. And let us be clear, in Syria today, more than double the people that died in Iraq have died in Syria, with the worst refugee crisis in World War II, and that is where we didn't intervene and remove the dictator. Robert. So I'll move along the rows if that's okay then.
You've got a fundamental disagreement with Chilcot. I mean, Chilcot says that you went to war when there was no imminent threat from Saddam. He does say that the legal process for authorizing the war was unsatisfactory, that there was no proper planning and preparation for the aftermath, that intelligence was flawed, and that our troops were inadequately resourced and therefore put at undue risk. Now, you have said two things today. On the one hand, you have created the impression that you're apologizing, but you also say that you stand by your decision to go to war. So what I'm unclear about, and I suspect people watching this now are unclear about, is what are you apologising for today?
For the mistakes.
But what mistakes? What are the mistakes that you acknowledge?
The mistakes on planning and process, I absolutely acknowledge. And I accept responsibility, and I'm not passing responsibility off to someone else. I accept full responsibility for those mistakes. But it's not inconsistent with that to still say that I believe we took the right decision. And the difficulty with a report like this is those two things get mixed up together. And by the way, in the first part of this military campaign, I mean, at one point, I think, again, in his statement, at least this morning, Sir John says, well, we didn't achieve our objectives. So the first part of this campaign was a brilliant military success, and the British troops, by the way, deserve enormous credit for that. What happened afterwards, we know. But the question is, would we be in a better place today if we'd taken the opposite decision, and that's the point of disagreement. I would take the same decision. If I was back in the same place with the same information, I would take the same decision, because obviously that's the decision I believed was right. All I'm saying today, because obviously some of the intelligence has turned out to be wrong, the planning wasn't done properly, I have to accept those criticisms, I accept responsibility for them. But I think people want me to go one step further, and this is my problem. It's a very fundamental problem, and I know it causes a lot of difficulty, even with people who might support me otherwise. They say, no, we want you to apologise for the decision. I can't do that. I can't honestly tell you, and I'm in the Middle East 2-3 times a month, and I tell you the roots of this terrorism go so much deeper than what happened in Iraq. We got caught up in the problem in Iraq. And ultimately, if we're not prepared to take these types of decisions and engage in this way, we will make the world less safe, which is why I believe in 2013, I think it was, when Parliament had to take the decision on Syria and chemical weapons, we made a fundamental mistake. I mean, I supported the Prime Minister at the time. And Libya shows you, and he very fairly today in his statement accepts how these things are difficult. But we're not going to be a better position if Britain absents itself from these decisions and from its place in the world.
But Mr. Blair, we shied away from intervening
I think,
militarily in
guys,
Syria because we did in Iraq. That's the point.
well, is it, or is it because we now know how difficult these interventions are? You see, the worry that I have from all of this is that the lessons we learn are lessons essentially of political safety and not political strategy. That ultimately, look, these decisions are difficult. I mean, I don't regret taking the decision, but there's no doubt about how difficult it's been, how controversial it's been, how much it's overshadowed. I mean, I'm of no significance in this at all, but it's obviously overshadows everything people think about me. Of course, this is really difficult. If we had intervened in Syria, it would also have been really difficult, by the way. But in my view, it would have been better if we'd taken the action rather than not. So, look, this is where, you know, I understand all the criticisms that the report makes of the process. But I do think, and I tried to do this, you know, it's too long to go into all these things, but there are real lessons of political strategy and military strategy. I don't see where these are in this report. I don't see where it tells you what's the right capability today to try and defeat this terrorism. What sort of alliances should Britain be constructing in the world today? How does Britain make sure that it leverages its power in the most effective way to defeat this terrorism? Given that the countries who are affected by this terrorism are countries of every description, whether they're aggressive or benign, north or south, pro-Iraq, anti-Iraq. Where does this report tell us what we should do as decision makers? Yes.
Tony Blair, it's very clear you stand by your decision. You have finally today apologised to the families who lost loved ones in the conflict. But this report is a devastating catalogue of the failures of your government and paints a very clear picture of a Prime Minister who was determined to act with the United States, almost come what may. Do you understand the sentiments of some of the families who believe you ought not just to have said sorry a long time ago, but that now you should face some kind of punishment?
By the way, it's completely incorrect that I've not said sorry before. I have always apologised for mistakes and in planning and in the intelligence, even though I'm not actually responsible for the intelligence. But, you see, I can't, it's true, I took the decision after 9/11 we should be America's closest ally. Again, you can disagree with that. I personally think when you're fighting this terrorism in the world today, it would be better if Britain today had a really strong, tight relationship with the United States. Now, I personally think when our parliament decided not to back President Obama in Syria, we really dealt a blow to that. I'm sorry, but I do. So none of that diminishes the pain of those families or my sorrow for them and sorrow for what they've gone through in their suffering. But I can't.
Says he was proud of that decision.
I know, but I with greatest respect, think, well, there's a whole other debate. But the fact is, they called upon us as the UK to back them at that point, and we didn't, and I regret that. Although, to be fair to the Prime Minister, he was advocating it.
What do you say to people who are calling for there to be some kinds of consequences for you personally?
That's up to them to call for what they want. But what I've tried to do today is explain why I acted as I did. And, you know, in the end, what more can I do than say to people, this is why I took the decision I did. And if you disagree with me, fine, but please stop saying I was lying or, you know, I had some sort of dishonest or underhand motive. I had the motives I explained. And the reason I can't depart from the decision is I look at what's happening in the world today, and I'm afraid, do not believe that we are safer today than we were back then.
Bill Neely, NBC News. I just want to pick up on two things you haven't mentioned and also on Matt Fry's earlier point. The report says basically you undermined the Security Council before the war, and at the end of the war basically ended in humiliation for British forces in Basra. Do you accept those are damning judgments and have done lasting damage to Britain's reputation? And secondly, on Matt's point on the memo of the 28th of July when you wrote that you would be with President Bush, whatever. Whatever what, Mr. Blair? Whatever the intelligence, whatever the evidence, whatever the UN said, what?
No, I was going to be with America in dealing with this, whatever the political difficulties, whatever problems there were going to be, I was going to put us alongside America in dealing with this. But it had to be done right, which is why the whole point of the 28th of July interaction was to persuade the Americans. Remember, there were members of the American administration completely opposed to doing this through the UN. The inquiry, I think, does actually say this. I persuaded President Bush to go down the UN route. That was the vital thing we were doing. Now, I wanted, first of all, by the way, I don't believe British troops were ever humiliated. I think British troops fought with enormous distinction in the south of Iraq.
That word is directly used in the
Yeah,
report.
well, I'm afraid I profoundly disagree that the British troops did anything other than a magnificent job in the south of Iraq. And if you go and talk...
Making a deal with the very people who were firing on them in order to stop the war. That was the allegation.
Again, I think that was done in 2008, but in any event, you know, those decisions are incredibly difficult. Most of the attacks actually in the south were attacks on British troops. That's why it was very different from what was happening in Baghdad. So anyway, there can be a debate about that, but I just want to place on record. I mean, when I was Prime Minister, all I can say is I found our armed forces absolutely magnificent. Every time they had to do something, they did it, and they did it in a brilliant way. And I won't accept any criticism of them, whatever. Now, on the UN Security Council, again, this is a really important point. Because we face exactly the same problem today. And I might say in parenthesis, you know, the UN Security Council, you can see in Syria how deadlocked it's been. And I don't notice President Putin going and seeking UN Security Council authority for the things that he has done. But when it's deadlocked like that, you can't say you're undermining its authority when we had gone back to the UN specifically to get a resolution that gave him one last chance to comply. The Americans wanted to do this military action, by the way, much earlier. The reason it was delayed was because we went through this UN process. So I understand, of course, it would have been better politically to have done it with a UN resolution. But by then you had a blockage. You had stalemate. Yeah. We're going to literally go around. Is that all right if we just go around the...
Tom Newton-Dunn from The Sun. Mr. Blair, you've talked entirely so far about the decisions before the war, almost nothing about the decisions in the aftermath and during the occupation period. Commanders on the ground, Chilcot says, urged you to reconsider the strategy. You yourself told George Bush in the letter in June 2003 that we are not geared up for this. It was quite clear at that stage something was going badly wrong on the ground. Why did you not therefore change that strategy, either pull the troops out or surge and reinforce them like the Americans did? Why did you just allow them to continue, which is what led to so many of their deaths?
Well, first of all, I don't believe that did at all. I mean, if you'd withdrawn the troops, I think that would have been very difficult. There was no need to surge the British troops at that point. We, of course, did adjust the strategy enormously, and you rightly say we're in correspondence continually with the Americans. I was saying, particularly after my visit, I think in May or June in 2003 in Iraq, we had to shift strategy. We did. We then put a lot more emphasis on building the Iraqi security capability. We made sure that, for example, the electoral process was put in place so that they could have an election as soon as possible. Remember, Iraq was a country that was governed by 20% governing the other 80%. That's why in the end it was never sustainable. And why had the Arab Spring, when the Arab Spring happened, Saddam had been in power, he would have been subject to the same revolt that was going on elsewhere. But it's not correct that we didn't shift strategy. But the inquiry itself says, and we can look out the reference, that they can't actually identify any other strategies that would have worked. And the reason for that is very simple. You get to a certain point with these terrorist groups where it's not the planning, it's the fighting. And that fighting had to be done, and it was done by our troops with enormous courage, and the Americans, and the troops of other nations. Remember, there were 40 nations in this coalition. Yeah.
Owen Bennett, Huffington Post. So John Chilcot said that you were warned that military action would increase the threat from Al-Qaeda to the UK and UK interests, and you were warned that an invasion might lead Iraq's weapons and capabilities falling into the hands of terrorists. If you were warned about that before the invasion, wasn't that precisely the grounds on which you wanted to reduce Saddam? So surely, knowing that, you'd be thinking you're making the situation worse.
No, the warning that they were giving, and it's important that the Chilcot inquiry makes reference to this, was a warning that, because everyone thought that he did have actual stockpiles, that they could fall into the wrong hands. But that can't be a reason for not removing him from power. That's a reason for doing it. As for the threat to the UK, I accept again, if the UK stands up in this fight against extremism and terrorism worldwide, if our forces are engaged in this, these people will try and attack us. They're attacking the French because of what they've done in Libya and Mali. Right? Beyond doubt, they will do that. But my point is, they would try and attack us anyway. They've attacked the countries who are pro-Iraq and the countries that have nothing to do with Iraq. I mean, where did Belgium fit into anything to do with Iraq? So my point is, I understand, yes, it's true, if you stand up and you take this action, these terrorists will try and target you, but frankly, they'll target you anyway. And that can't be a reason for not taking them on and fighting them.
David Hughes from the Press Association. Given that Chilcot has found there was no imminent threat from Saddam and that the process of the military build-up had been in place long before, how was it that the troops were so poorly equipped? How was it that for the aftermath they didn't have the correct equipment, there were not enough helicopters, not enough IED-resistant vehicles in place? And do you accept the resources were far too stretched trying to fight in both Iraq and Afghanistan?
Well, I don't accept the latter point. And by the way, when we made that additional commitment to Afghanistan, I was very, very clear. I remember the cabinet meeting very well, where I said we must not do this unless we can do both missions. And I think you will find that the report also says there was no occasion where we were asked either for more money, for more equipment, or more equipment where we said no. And both myself and Gordon Brown at the time made it absolutely clear that whatever was requested should be given. Now, I do have to say, you know, we were absolutely prepared for the campaign to remove Saddam because it was brilliantly successful, and we should never forget that. That was one. There were two strategic objectives, okay? One of which we succeeded, and one of which we have not. The one in which we succeeded was to remove Saddam and remove him as a threat. The other was to make Iraq free and secure. That's true. They've got elections today. They've got an elected government. They are an illegitimate government. They're fighting terrorism today, but it's also true that particularly in that immediate aftermath of removing Saddam, we did not provide the security we had promised. Yeah.
Stevens from the Daily Telegraph. The families who have lost loved ones in Iraq are now saying they're prepared to take legal action against you personally. Do you think they're justified in doing that?
I obviously stand by the decision I took, and I've explained all of that today. I understand their, not just their grief, but I understand their anger and their concern. But I need people also to try to put themselves back in my shoes at that time, taking that decision, and understand why I took that decision, why I think it's right, and why I will never, ever accept that those troops who got injured or gave their lives in Iraq did so in vain. I believe they ended up fighting after we got rid of Saddam, they were fighting exactly the forces of extremism we see everywhere in the world today. And that's why even as I sympathize profoundly with the sorrow, I cannot accept the implicit nature of the criticism, which is that they died in vain. I do not believe that they did so. You know, in the first 6 months of this year, it's worth just reflecting on this. 3,500 troops, troops of different countries, have lost their lives fighting this terrorism. 3,500. This is a battle that's going on day in, day out around the world. Our troops were involved in that battle, and I will never ever accept that in fighting it they fought for a cause that was worthless or in vain.
As a Little Daily Express, I'm still not clear on what mistakes you actually think you made. Perhaps you could name 2 specific things that you wake up in the middle of the night thinking, I really should have done that. Not just general, there were mistakes made, but specific mistakes that you think you made.
Specific mistakes. Look, one thing that the report actually doesn't do, but I reproach myself for, is that I think when you look at what we found, I think now if I was planning such a campaign, I would look far more carefully at the possibility of the link of external people linking up with internal elements of insurgency or insurrection. Now, there were scattered warnings, although not really about Iran or Syria, by the way. But that is the fundamental thing that almost made Iraq ungovernable until the surge. The fundamental thing that went wrong. It's not complicated. It's absolutely clear. It's external elements in Iran linking up with Shia extremism, from outside Iraq, Sunni extremism linking up with al-Qaeda, and then, as we now know and discovered in these last couple of years, Syria deliberately sending thousands of people to join the insurgency across the border into Iraq. That is something I think about the whole time. And one of the things that you learn exactly the same from Syria and Libya, is it's when the external elements join up with the internal elements that you get a problem that can be almost ungovernable. And one of the reasons why it's so important actually to learn the lessons, for example, a military strategy, is how do you deal with that? And unfortunately, the report doesn't really deal with that. Yes.
Jason Groves from the Daily Mail. Jeremy Corbyn today said that you misled MPs, pointing to the section in the report which says you prosecuted the case with a certainty which was not justified. There's been a call from the Labour front bench for you to face prosecution. How do you feel about sort of splitting the Labour Party in the way that this decision appears to have done?
The important thing about a decision like this is you take it for the reasons you believe to be right. And by the way, there was no misleading of Parliament. And the report accepts explicitly that I acted both in good faith and that I genuinely believed the intelligence I was given. And I brought with me, in case I can simply show it to you afterwards rather than reading it all out. If you go back to those Joint Intelligence Committee documents sent to me in March and September, I simply say to any fair-minded person, go and read the reports, see what was said to me, and then tell me if you wouldn't have believed that there was not merely a problem of intent, but an actual developed programme of weapons.
Well, Jeremy Corbyn did.
Well, that's for Jeremy. Sorry, I think otherwise.
Rowena.
Yeah.
Rowena Mason from The Guardian. Can you be more specific about the errors that you are apologising for, the errors of planning and processes? Which things happened that you are now sorry for?
I mean, I think to the point that I was just making earlier, although it's not actually something the inquiry particularly centres on, it's the analysis of the analysis pre-conflict, of the possibility of external elements linking up with internal elements. But there are things that I've accepted during my statement. You know, I think in retrospect, it would have been better to have more formal options papers presented to Cabinet at certain points. I think for sure now you would approach the situation differently in how you interacted with the United States, and I accept that as well. I think there are various process points, for example, disclosing the Attorney General's advice to Cabinet would have been simpler and better to have done that. I don't think any of those things would have altered the nature of the decision, but I'm perfectly happy to accept responsibility for them. But I do think at each point of this, once you've done that, you come back to the decision.
Nick Watt, BBC Newsnight. Can I just ask you, you've expressed sorrow for what happened in the most emotional statement I've heard you make on Iraq, but then you say on the fundamentals you stand by your decision. Can you see why that explains why people don't trust you and why potentially there is this rupture between the political elite and voters, that we have a teary Tony Blair saying, I feel your pain, but fundamentally, I did nothing wrong? And if I may, you say that for us to understand what happened, we need to understand how the calculus of risk changed after 9/11. But you were told then, and we know now, that there was no link between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda, but there were links between Al-Qaeda and some of the Gulf Arab states who you maintained strong diplomatic relations with when you were Prime Minister, and upon whom you've built your business career since then.
First of all, by the way, I didn't. But anyway, secondly, there is actually no, just think about this for a moment, there is no inconsistency in expressing my sorrow for those that have lost their lives, my regret, and my apology for the mistakes, but still saying I believe the decision was right. There is no inconsistency in that. I understand why that makes people, some people at least, angry with me, because they want me to say what I can't, in all frankness, say, which is that I think we should have taken a different decision, that either we shouldn't have been with the US or we shouldn't have removed Saddam. I can't say that. I don't believe it. So I think in the end that's, I mean, I'm sorry again if people find that difficult to reconcile. But you know, I spend so much of my time thinking about this issue. I spend so much of my life analysing it. You know, I would be making a concession I didn't believe if I said to you, I think if we'd left him there, it would be better. And I only say, you know, when you look at this report, and this is the problem with a report like this, for example, they say that the Iraq Survey Group findings are significant and they endorse them. But that's got to make a difference to your analysis of this situation. If that report is right, sanctions would have gone, we wouldn't have removed him, and he would have been back to doing what he was doing. Surely I'm entitled to say, if you're telling me the decision's wrong, you've got to tell me why either that report's wrong, or if it's not wrong, surely it makes a difference to your analysis of the decision. So, look, I've said that already, but the other thing is on the links between AQ and Saddam. You know, it was never our case. There were elements of the American administration that argued that there was a link between Saddam and Al-Qaeda. That was never my case. My case is the one I expressed today. It is the one I expressed at the time. I think it is still one of the biggest risks we face, which is if you allow the proliferation of chemical or biological or nuclear weapons or its technology, then the risk is it falls into the hands of these terrorists at some point. That was our worry. And remember, I was taking this decision not 18 months after 9/11, when we'd seen the mass casualties, and when we realized if these people could kill more people, they would kill more people.
Rob Hutton from Bloomberg. Can I just pick you up on something you said just then, that you would handle a relationship with America differently? I think one of the things a lot of people felt at the time and since was they looked at your incredibly close relationship with George W. Bush. And frankly, a lot of people here looked at George W. Bush and said, this is not a man that we trust to make these types of decisions. And he seems incredibly gung-ho, and there's Tony Blair just off going along with him. And that seems, in many ways, to be borne out by the report today, that you didn't have the influence that you thought that you were having. What would you do differently? And just, are you still in contact with George W. Bush? Do you still speak?
By the way, I'm in contact with all the former presidents I work with. But where I was talking about the relationship with the US, I mean very specifically on the planning for the aftermath. I think in retrospect it was clear that I relied too much on the assurances that were given, and there were obvious real problems within their system. Those problems have been well documented and well analysed. I just don't agree with people about the relationship with the US. You know, when I was Prime Minister and we had that very close relationship, and I had it with President Clinton and then with President Bush, it was important. If I hadn't had that closeness of relationship, I don't know that we could have done Kosovo in that way. That really depended to a large degree on my relationship with President Clinton. With President Bush, we made a huge difference. We got them to go down the UN route. So it's no great secret the Vice President and many parts of the administration did not want to do that. President Bush, I think in part of my prompting, was the first American president to commit to a Palestinian state, was the first to agree to publish the roadmap, despite the strong opposition of the then Israeli government. In 2005 at the G8, we got American commitments on Africa and indeed on climate change that would never have been secured without the closeness of that relationship. I mean, one of the things I believe about this country is that in today's world, it's got to exert maximum influence and power through its relationships. And I always said, you can go back and you can read it, you've got America on the one side, Europe on the other, you keep both relations strong, and in doing that, you will have a much better ability to influence the world in the way that you want, in the interests of your people, in the national interest. And that's when, as I say, a majority of European nations were with us in that coalition, by the way. It wasn't just Japan and Australia and others. A majority of Europe came with us. So this relationship with America, they say in their report, by the way, and I just wanted to pick this up because, I completely disagree with this. They say, well, France and Germany have got a strong relationship with America today, despite their disagreement at the time. Yeah, their disagreement at the time was a real problem for their relationship. And subsequent leaders had to work very hard to create the relationship with America today. And I do believe that with this fight against terrorism, we're better to be strongly alongside the US. I think it's necessary for our own security. But, other people can take a different view.
Jason Beattie from the Daily Mail. Do you think, in retrospect, you were too trusting of the intelligence services and the information they provided to you? And do you think it was a dereliction not to have probed that information more closely and more rigorously? And secondly, can I come back to Nick's point? One of the findings of Sir John's report is he says that the way the case for war was presented has left his quotes a damaging legacy which has undermined trust in government. Do you think there are consequences of that and they've been seen more recently?
Well, look, first of all, when the allegations first surfaced that we had falsified or improperly interfered with the intelligence, you might remember I agreed to hold the Hutton inquiry. I was putting the government and myself in a position no government or prime minister ever put themselves in before, in terms of giving evidence, being cross-examined. There have been 5 separate reports. The Butler inquiry, Foreign Affairs Committee, there's another report, and then this one. All of which find, and it's actually there in the report, that we did not improperly influence that intelligence. That wasn't my question. No, but your question was about trust. And look, let's be clear, the allegation of trust, when it comes to me, goes very quickly into the allegation you lied about the intelligence. That's what people say the whole time. Right? Now, actually, if people are being fair and read the report, that allegation should be put to rest because it's not true. And it never was true. And it was inquired into again and again and again. Of course, if people think the Prime Minister of the day has lied to them about intelligence, it's going to damage trust. But I didn't. Now, on the intelligence itself, look, one of one of the areas of the report I do agree with are all the recommendations around intelligence. And there are people better qualified than me to explain why these recommendations are sensible. That is, absolutely right, and we can learn the lessons from that. The only thing I say to you is I obviously relied on the information I was given, and I will never criticise our intelligence people because they do a fantastic job for this country.
The damaging trust in government or something?
Dealt with it, didn't I? I think so.
Lucy Fisher from The Times. Jonathan Powell and David Manning urged you to remove the phrase, "I will be with you whatever," from the key memo to George W. Bush. Given that you had been warned that that phrase, that pledge, went too far, and the significance of it, isn't it disingenuous to claim that it wouldn't be viewed as and wasn't intended as a blank check to the US?
Well, it's not. It's not a blank check and wasn't taken as that because, by the way, the Americans were absolutely clear what we were saying. And if you read the whole of the memo, it makes it absolutely clear that we were saying we had to go down the UN route, we had to build a broad coalition. That I couldn't be sure, I think I actually said at one point, I couldn't be sure of the support of Parliament or the Cabinet even. And they were more concerned about whether there were, I think there were earlier words that were used that were taken out. The fact is, yes, of course, everyone was concerned, but I was also concerned to make sure that at that crucial moment in time, when I was right on the cusp of this argument in the center of the American administration, do you take the UN route or not? I needed to make sure they took the UN route, and they did. And by the way, the inquiry does note this, there was a conversation after that November resolution when it was made absolutely clear by myself to President Bush, and he accepted that if Saddam complies, there's no military conflict. So when people say, you know, the commitment was unqualified, it was absolutely qualified because we went to the UN. And if Saddam had complied, we wouldn't have been in conflict. But, you know, one of the things, again, I ask people to go back and look at is it's absolutely clear he never had any intention, really, of complying. He would have been back to his old tricks if we'd allowed him to survive. I need to go to the back there. And then, who's still to come? Yeah.
Hi, Henry Matheson from Financial Times. You say that this will forever stand over how people view you. Do you see it as increasingly futile to make public interventions on matter of policies, given the shadow of Iraq?
Well, people can listen or not listen. I mean, it's up to them. I think there's more understanding in the country than you sometimes think of the fact that people know that when you're Prime Minister, you have to take decisions. I think the single most important thing is that people understand I took it in good faith. That is really critical. And, you know, I think to be fair about it, this report at no point says I was taking it for reasons other than the reasons I gave or that I took it in bad faith. And that's the thing that damages me or any other political leader. You know, one of the things I sometimes say to people as well is that the time you should trust a politician most is when they're doing what's hardest. You know, when you're doing what's easy, okay, most politicians can do that. But I had to take a decision that was really hard. And, you know, despite what people may think, I thought about that decision really, really deeply then. And I go back over it all the time. All the time I relive it every single day. There's not a single day that goes by that I don't think about it. But I always come back to the nature of it. Right to remove him or not. Right to be with the US or not. There's no way, there's no third way in that. I'm afraid you're either there or you're not. And that's what I had to decide. So if people don't want to listen to anything else I say, then I can't help that, I'm afraid. That's their decision. Yeah.
Mr. Blair, Jim Waterson from BuzzFeed News. Back in 2003, you said that history would be the judge of your decision to invade Iraq. And 13 years on, this is history's first proper judgment of the decision to invade Iraq. Why is it that you seem to be rejecting some of the key findings, and how do you think history will treat this decision?
Well, if history is going to judge Iraq and removing Saddam in 2003, you know, let's be very clear about this decision. It cut with the grain of what's happening all over the Middle East. This is why I think when people, you know, I hope in the end, and I believe, by the way, that Iraq will stabilize and the Middle East will stabilize. Because my analysis of what's going on in the Middle East is this one big struggle to get rid of sectarian religious politics and replace it with pluralistic, tolerant, religiously tolerant politics. And it's about the desire for rule-based economies and not corrupt economies. Now, I think those are the two things that people are struggling for all over the Middle East. Iraq under Saddam had no chance. Iraq today has a chance. So what history ends up deciding about Iraq is going to depend a lot on what happens in the future. But I just ask people to think about this for a moment. All over the Middle East, these regimes have gone. Now, what you sometimes find in the West in the debate, and again, the report doesn't really deal with any of these things, is people say, you know, it would be better if you kept the dictators in power, because at least then you keep the situation stable. There's two things we should remember about that. One, there was no stability in Iraq if you were Kurdish or you're Shia. You were subject to brutal, brutal repression. And secondly, that stability is not going to hold. That's what the Arab Spring teaches you. And that's why, in a sense, what we did was move ahead of that. But that's not the reason we did it, but that's why when history looks back on this, yes, you can go to all the mistakes in foresight and planning and process and all the rest of it, but when you come back to the basic decision, I believe that history will take a different view.
Tom Peck from The Independent. Today you stand by the decision to invade and you say that it was right to maintain the relationship with the US. Had you been dealing with a White House that was not committed to an invasion, would you have sought to persuade them that an invasion was the correct thing to do?
Well, that is a very good question, actually. I mean, I think after 9/11, I was definitely in favour of dealing with the potential for chemical, biological or nuclear devices falling into terrorist hands. So I would have definitely been in favour of doing that. And I think any American president at the time would have been in favour of doing that, by the way. I can't say how the path of the negotiation would have been different. I still think, remember the first military action I ever took was with President Clinton in Iraq. And it was after that action that it became the official policy of the American government to change the regime in Iraq. That's one of the tensions in policy making between ourselves and the Americans all the way through. Their policy was regime change. It wasn't our policy. Our policy was the security aspect. So I can't be sure, but the one thing I know, and there are a lot of criticisms of President Bush, obviously, but the world is subject to this terrorism and violence, which is essentially what happened to us in Iraq. It happened to us in Afghanistan. It's happening the world over, and I don't think we've got the right strategy yet to deal with it. And I think what's important is that we learn the lessons both of the Bush period of policy making, but also of the last 8 years as well. And the consequences of the Arab Spring in Libya and Syria. And so I don't know how it would have turned out if we'd had a different American president. But I was facing the situation I was.
Hi, William James from Reuters. You asked people today to put themselves in your shoes as Prime Minister. If I could just turn that on its head and ask you to put yourself in the shoes of an Iraqi citizen who's seen swathes of the country overtaken by Islamic State, 150,000 civilian deaths, regular bombings like the one that killed 250 people this week. Would you still be able to say that they're better off?
Well, you should let the Iraqis speak for themselves in this. And I think what you'll find is that some will say no, but if you're a Kurd, if you're down in the south, I think you will find a different perspective. I think, one of the things that is strange about this situation is that there was a very strong statement put out by the aide to the president of Iraq today, saying why he thought Iraq was better off as a result of this. And I just make the point that look at Syria and look at Iraq. In Iraq, you've got a government that's fighting the terrorism, and they're doing so, okay, with whatever difficulty, but they are. And one of the reasons for these terrible attacks like the one earlier in the week is precisely because the Iraqi government, with American and other support, is gradually squeezing them back and out of Iraq. They've lost something like 50%, I think, of their territory in Iraq. So, that is, again, something that will develop over time, but it's important that if people say what Iraq is like, they put both sides of the situation today. And, you know, I know from the many messages I receive from Iraq, and I keep in touch with people there, you know, yes, there will be some people who will strongly disagree with what we've done, but there will be other people who say, no, despite all the difficulties, it was the right thing to do. We've got 3 more to go. I'll come back, Nick, in 1 second at the end.
Thank you, Nick Robertson from CNN, and thank you for taking all these questions. The inquiry said you overestimated your ability to influence American decision-making. Yes, you were able to get them to move towards the UN Security Council in the first case. But when push came to shove and the second Security Council resolution loomed large, were you really able there to use your influence? Do you recognize what the inquiry says, that you did overestimate your ability to influence? And I just want to add a second question, if I may. We've heard you talk a lot about how you had to make the decision, I had to make the decision, I had to do this. The inquiry is implicit that there were times when you could have shared more information with your colleagues, broadened your decision-making. Do you recognize that about yourself?
On the second point, I mean, yes, I think there are times when that would have been sensible, although, you know, this was the continual discussion with all my colleagues. But I agree that it might have been, in retrospect, better if we'd had a measure of formality in some of the papers presented and so on. I accept that. But I mean, it was impossible to be in the cabinet at the time, and we were discussing this literally, 26 times I think we discussed it in cabinet, and a lot of these were detailed discussions. I didn't overestimate my influence with the US, by the way. I mean, I was completely realistic. We were a junior partner. 95% of the assets in the Iraqi mission were American. But I thought it was important, and remember, as I keep going back to the time, my worry after 9/11 was that America decided it was going to go on its own without a coalition and go after the people that had caused this destruction in their country. And you've really got to go back to that time and feel that atmosphere. And one of the reasons why I wanted America to recognize us as a strong, reliable ally, you know, that's why I used words like, you know, I'm going to be with you come what may, not unconditionally and unqualified. I couldn't do that. But I wanted them to know you've got someone who's alongside you here, precisely because I wanted them to build a coalition. And that coalition actually held together well in Afghanistan. Now, when it came to Iraq, I pulled them into the UN process precisely to build the coalition. We could have built it then. When we came to the second resolution, I again persuaded President Bush didn't want to give any more time at that point. I actually constructed with the inspectors 6 tests that he had to comply with. And the Americans did not want that resolution. But in the end, what they said was, okay, but there's got to be an ultimatum. If he doesn't comply, we can't keep our troops down there and let him carry on giving a little bit of compliance when he felt the threat was there and withdrawing when he didn't. And in the end, we couldn't get agreement to that. But it's not that I didn't try. So I had real influence, but you know, of course, they were always going to be the senior partner. And one of the difficult questions for Britain now is, given that you're going to be in these types of missions, I mean, what is the likelihood of British military participation in the world today? It's almost certainly, you know, the Falklands is a totally exceptional set of circumstances. The likelihood is you're going to be facing not an attack on your own territory, but you're going to be working in coalition with others, probably under the leadership of the United States, in these countries where this Islamist terrorism exists. You know, we've got to decide as a country, are we, you know, because that means you're part of a coalition and you're a junior partner in that coalition. That is inevitable.
They didn't say that you didn't try, but that you overestimated your ability.
Well, I've had a very clear estimation of my own influence, and I used it insofar as I possibly could. But you have to understand the American administration were absolutely clear what they wanted to. And so in the end, as I say, the decision is Were you with them or not? And I don't, I found it difficult to follow, particularly for what Sir John Chilcot said this morning, where I thought he struck a somewhat different tone than part of the report. I found it difficult whether he was actually saying, well, you just shouldn't have gone with America, or whether he was saying you shouldn't have gone then. But I didn't have the ability to delay at that point. I had to decide. I mean, I understand what he's saying, and I thought about that at the time too, but in the end, if someone's going to take, I do really feel this, and I think I've got the right to say this at least, that if someone's going to say the decision's wrong, they've got to spell out what they say would have happened if I'd taken the opposite decision. And what isn't fair is to say, well, I don't think you should have done that, but I don't take a view on what you should have done. I'm afraid that's not decision making.
Enrico Franceschini, La Repubblica, Italy. Mr. Blair, do you feel more anguished or relieved or perhaps worried by this report?
Look, this is an issue which I think about all the time and people ask me about all the time. I don't suppose this report will bring this issue to an end, but it should, as I say, put to rest some of the allegations. The allegations around good faith, and I think this is important. People can criticize me for the planning, and they can criticize the decision. But if people are being fair and they read this report, they should not, from now on, criticize good faith. But, we live in a political world. Okay, Nick, you get the last question here.
Thank you. Nick Watt, BBC Newsnight. Thank you for being generous with your time and taking a second question. Can I just ask you on this question of trust? One of your big themes today is Britain needs to stand tall in the world's multilateral institutions, punching above its weight. But surely that vision is crumbling before your eyes after the vote in the referendum. And is there not a part of you that thinks that the reason for that vote is this disconnect between the political elite and voters? The voters don't trust the political elite. And do you not think that we can trace that back to the 18th of March 2003, when a British Prime Minister took this country to war on a prospectus which, diplomatically speaking, turned out to have a few question marks over it? And you may have acted in good faith, you may not have done that knowingly, you may not have lied, but nevertheless, people saw their Prime Minister taking them to war on a prospectus that now has question marks on it, and they don't trust you, and they don't trust your successors.
Well, I think it's a bit of a stretch to go for the European referendum back to this. I mean, the question of trust in politics is a whole other issue. I think you're entitled to two things as a member of the public with your political leaders. I think you're entitled to them taking the decisions in good faith, but I also think you're entitled to have them take the decisions. And, I said to you earlier, I think the time you should trust a politician most is when they're doing what's least popular. Because unless they're a fool, they're doing it because they believe in it. I think the disconnect between politicians and the public has got a lot of different aspects and dimensions to it. It's a topic for another day, but if you were concerned that your Prime Minister took this decision on the basis that they knew was false, or they took this decision for reasons that were nothing to do with the reasons they gave, then you would be entitled to mistrust them deeply. But this report makes it clear, whatever criticisms you make or whether you agree or disagree with the decision, I did it for the reasons I said I did it. And I stand by it today for those reasons, again, today. And, I understand why Sir John or his colleagues may take a different point of view. But I was the elected Prime Minister at the time. And I really do believe, ultimately, it's better that you have your Prime Ministers in a position where they take the decisions rather than duck them. Okay, I think that's enough. Thank you.